Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. What would you do if your neighbor started pouring concrete for a huge pool in your backyard? I tried to be reasonable, but she refused to even look at my property survey. She thought she was winning, but she had no idea I was about to turn her own expensive mistake against her. I bought my house in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 8 years ago. It's one of those areas where everyone knows everyone, people actually wave to each other, and the biggest excitement is usually someone's Christmas light display. The house itself was everything I wanted. 3 bedrooms, a decent backyard, and several beautiful mature oak trees along the back section. Some of those trees were probably 60 or 70 years old, massive things that provided incredible shade and privacy. They were honestly one of the main reasons I chose this house. In our county, any tree over 36 inches in diameter is automatically protected by county ordinance, meaning you need special permits for any construction near their root zones. I'd done my research before buying because I wanted to make sure those trees would be protected. My neighbors were great. The Hendersons on one side were a retired couple who kept an immaculate garden. On the other side was a single guy named Mark who traveled for work and was hardly ever home. Across the street were the Patels, who had 2 young kids always playing basketball in their driveway. It was genuinely pleasant, the kind of neighborhood where you could leave your garage door open without worry. Then, about 3 years ago, Mark sold his house. The new owner was a woman in her mid-50s named Julia Morse. She moved in on a Saturday morning with a moving truck and what seemed like an excessive amount of patio furniture. I went over that afternoon with a plate of cookies to introduce myself, as you do. Julia was polite enough during that first interaction, but there was something in her tone that set off a tiny alarm bell. She asked a lot of questions about the neighborhood, not the friendly "what's it like here" questions, but more like an interrogation about property lines, easements, and whether there were any neighborhood organizations. I answered honestly, told her it was a relaxed neighborhood, everyone minded their own business but helped out when needed. She smiled tightly and thanked me for the cookies. About 2 months after she moved in, I got a letter in my mailbox. Not a friendly note, a formal letter on actual letterhead that read Woodland Estates Homeowners Association. I'd never heard of it. The letter informed me that Julia had done research and discovered our neighborhood was technically part of this HOA that had been formed back in the 1990s. Most of us had never known about it. I certainly hadn't been told when I bought my house, and there was no mention of it in any of my closing documents. My title insurance made no reference to it either. Turns out the HOA had gone completely dormant for over a decade. No meetings, no dues collected, nothing. But it was still legally registered with the county. Julia had somehow tracked down the old incorporation documents and discovered that the bylaws were still technically valid. She'd managed to get herself elected president by organizing a meeting that only about 5 households attended. Since the old bylaws didn't specify a quorum for elections, those 5 votes were enough to make it official. Suddenly, we had an HOA president with actual legal authority over the neighborhood, even though 90% of us hadn't realized we were part of an HOA at all. The letters started coming regularly after that. My fence was 2 inches too tall according to bylaws from 1993. The Hendersons got cited because their garden gnomes were considered lawn ornamentation in excess of community standards. The Patel's basketball hoop was improperly positioned within the front yard setback area. Every letter was formal, cited specific bylaw sections, and threatened fines if we didn't comply. Most of us ignored them. We consulted with attorneys individually and discovered that while the HOA was technically legitimate, enforcing decades-old bylaws against people who'd bought their homes with no knowledge of the HOA was legally complicated. Julia could threaten all she wanted, but actually collecting fines would require her to take each of us to court individually and prove we'd knowingly violated bylaws we'd never been informed about. It would be expensive and time-consuming for her, with no guarantee of success. After a few months of her letters being ignored, Julia seemed to shift tactics. If she couldn't control the neighborhood through bylaws, she'd lead by example with her own property. She started talking about improvements she was planning, new landscaping, a renovated back deck, maybe even a pool. The pool idea concerned me a bit because of how our properties were laid out. Her backyard extended quite far back, but there was an odd angle to the property line between us. From standing in either of our yards, you couldn't really tell where the boundary was just by looking. The fence that Mark had installed years ago was ornamental, not a property line marker, and it wasn't even straight. I'd seen the survey from when I bought my house, and I knew the actual property line cut diagonally across the back section in a way that wasn't obvious to the eye. I didn't think much more about it until I came home from work one Tuesday afternoon and saw a surveying crew in Julia's backyard. That seemed responsible, having the property surveyed before major construction. I figured she was doing things properly. 2 weeks later, I noticed construction materials being delivered to her house. Pallets of concrete, stacks of rebar, piles of what looked like pool equipment. Then the excavation started. The noise was incredible. Heavy machinery running from 7 in the morning until 6 at night, 4 days straight. My whole house shook. The oak trees dropped leaves like it was autumn in the middle of June from the vibration. I tried to be patient. Construction is disruptive, but it's temporary. I could deal with it. On the 4th day, I walked into my backyard to check on my own trees. I was worried about damage from all the vibration. That's when I got a clear view of the excavation site. The hole was massive, and unless I was completely wrong about where the property line ran, a significant portion of it was on my property. I went inside and dug out my survey from when I'd purchased the house. I compared it to what I could see from my back window. The property line ran at about a 40-degree angle across the back of our lots, starting from a point near the front corner and extending back. Based on my survey, I estimated that about 5 feet of the length of her pool excavation was completely on my land. I walked over to Julia's house and knocked on the door. She answered wearing gardening gloves and looking annoyed at the interruption. "Hi, Julia," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "I wanted to talk to you about the pool construction. I think there might be an issue with the property line." "There's no issue," she said immediately. "I had the property surveyed." "I have my survey from when I bought the house, and I think the excavation extends onto my property. Could we compare surveys? Maybe there's just some confusion about where the line runs." "My survey is correct," she said. "The pool is entirely on my property. I paid a professional surveyor, and everything is exactly where it's supposed to be." "Could I see the survey?" I asked. "Just to compare it with mine and understand where the discrepancy is." "I don't have to show you anything," she said, her voice hardening. "This is my property, and I'm conducting legal construction on my property. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the county." She closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, genuinely shocked. I'd expected we could have a reasonable conversation, look at the surveys together, maybe discover that either I was wrong or there was a simple mistake to correct. Instead, she'd refused to even discuss it. The next morning, I called a surveying company and explained the situation. They sent someone out that afternoon. The surveyor spent about 3 hours taking measurements, checking property pins, and placing bright orange stakes along what he confirmed was the actual property line. His findings matched my original survey exactly. The property line cut diagonally across the back, and approximately 5 feet of her pool excavation was on my property. I had invited Julia to be present for this survey so we could both see the results at the same time and avoid any accusations of bias. I'd left a note on her door and sent an email. She'd responded with a single line, "Not necessary. My survey is correct." The surveyor took photos and prepared a formal report. I looked at his findings, then at the construction continuing in Julia's yard, and realized I needed legal help. I contacted a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. His name was James Chen, and after reviewing my survey, Julia's refusal to discuss the issue, and photos of the ongoing construction, he was very direct about what needed to happen. "She's building a permanent structure on your property without permission," he said. "If that pool gets finished and you don't act, it becomes a lot more complicated to resolve. We need to stop construction immediately and get this sorted out before the pool is completed." He filed for an emergency injunction to halt construction. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, which felt impossibly fast, but James explained that because construction was actively ongoing and would cause permanent changes to the property, courts treated these situations with urgency. At the hearing, Julia showed up with her own attorney, a severe-looking woman named Ms. Reeves, who carried a leather briefcase that looked more expensive than my car. James presented my survey, the new survey I'd commissioned, and photos showing the orange stakes marking the property line running through the excavation site. Julia's attorney presented her survey, except when we looked at it, it became clear what had happened. Her surveyor had been given the wrong property address. The survey she'd commissioned was for a completely different lot, a parcel about 3 blocks away with a similar street address. Either someone had transposed numbers or she'd provided the wrong information. The survey itself was perfectly professional and accurate, but it was for the wrong property. The judge looked at my surveys, looked at her survey with the wrong address clearly printed at the top, and asked Julia's attorney directly, Did your client verify that this survey was for the correct property before beginning construction? Ms. Reeves looked at the survey, seemed to notice the address issue for the first time, and went slightly pale. Your Honor, I'll need a moment to consult with my client. There was a whispered conversation. Then Ms. Reeves straightened and said, Your Honor, there appears to have been an administrative error regarding the survey address. However, my client proceeded with construction in good faith based on the survey she received. Good faith requires basic verification, the judge said. The property address is printed right at the top of the document. He granted the injunction immediately, ordering all construction to cease until the property line dispute was resolved. Julia's face went red, then white. She stood up like she wanted to say something, but Ms. Reeves put a hand on her arm and shook her head. The next step was getting a court-ordered survey completed by a neutral third party selected by the court. This took another 2 weeks. The court surveyor confirmed exactly what my surveys had shown. The property line ran diagonally across the back of our lots, and approximately 5 feet of the pool excavation was on my property. With that settled, the court ordered Julia to remove all construction from my property and restore the land to its previous condition. She had 90 days to comply. I thought that would be the end of it. She'd fill in the excavation on my property, complete her pool entirely on her own land, and we'd go back to ignoring each other. I should have known better. For the first month of the 90-day deadline, nothing happened. The excavation site sat there, accumulating rainwater and becoming a mosquito breeding ground. I had James send a letter reminding Julia of the court order and the approaching deadline. No response. At the 60-day mark, still nothing. James sent another letter, this time warning that we'd file for contempt if she didn't begin compliance work immediately. This finally got a response, but not from Julia. Her attorney requested a meeting to discuss the specific requirements for compliance. We met in James's office. Ms. Reeves arrived with a notepad and that same expensive briefcase. Julia wasn't with her. My client wants to comply with the court order, Ms. Reeves began, but we need clarity on what exactly constitutes acceptable restoration of the property. The order is clear, James said. Remove all structures from the property and restore it to its previous condition. Yes, but specifically, what does that entail? Does Mrs. Morse need to fill in the excavation or simply remove the concrete foundation that was poured? The excavation is on my client's property without permission, James said. It needs to be filled in and returned to grade level. And what type of fill material does your client require? I saw where this was going. She was looking for wiggle room, some way to comply with the letter of the order while making things difficult. But her question also gave me an idea. I leaned over and whispered to James. He nodded slowly, then turned back to Ms. Reeves. The court order requires your client to fill in and cap the excavation in compliance with all applicable county codes for permanent subsurface closure. Ms. Reeves wrote this down. So any fill method that meets county code requirements would be acceptable? As long as it's done entirely on her property and complies with all relevant ordinances, James confirmed. Ms. Reeves seemed satisfied with this answer. We wrapped up the meeting and I left feeling like maybe this would finally be resolved. Here's what I knew that Julia apparently didn't. In our county, there are specific codes for closing abandoned pools and large excavations. You have 2 main options. The first is filling with compacted dirt, which is cheaper but requires multiple inspections at different fill stages, extensive drainage planning, and usually takes several weeks because you can only fill so much at a time before compaction. The second option is filling with concrete for permanent structural closure. This is much more expensive, but it's faster and requires fewer inspections. Most people choose dirt because of the cost difference. But here's the thing. Permanent structural closure with concrete assumes the structure being closed is entirely on property you own and control. It also requires checking for any environmental restrictions, protected tree zones, or drainage issues. If someone demanded code compliance for permanent closure and chose concrete without checking all these other requirements, they could create new problems for themselves. I was betting Julia would take the bait. She'd shown a pattern of doing things the most aggressive way possible, and concrete would let her finish quickly, and, in her mind, probably make that section of my property more difficult to use in the future. She could get it done fast, get one inspection, and consider it a power move. 2 weeks later, I saw the concrete trucks arrive. Not 1, not 2, but 3 full trucks over the course of a single day. They were pumping concrete into the entire pool excavation cavity, all of it. The portion on her property and the portion on my property. The whole thing was being filled with solid concrete. I stood in my backyard and watched, and I'll admit I smiled. She'd taken the bait completely. The concrete work took 2 days. When it was finished, there was a massive concrete pad where the pool excavation had been. It extended from her property across the boundary line and about 5 feet into my property. The surface was smooth and level, clearly professional work. Julia's attorney sent notice to James that she'd complied with the court order. All structures removed, cavity filled, and capped per code requirements for permanent closure. Photos were attached showing the concrete pad along with a copy of the county inspection certificate confirming it met codes for permanent subsurface closure. James called me. She filled it with concrete, the whole thing. I see that, I said, still looking out at the pad from my kitchen window. That's an interesting choice. Very interesting, I agreed. I think we need to have an environmental compliance specialist come take a look at this situation. I contacted a company that specialized in environmental compliance and property remediation. They sent someone out 2 days later, a woman named Dr. Sarah Bellamy, who spent 3 hours examining the concrete pad, checking drainage, taking soil samples around the perimeter, and measuring distances to various landmarks. Her report identified several critical problems. First, while the concrete technically met county codes for abandoned pool closure, those codes assumed the pool was being closed on property the owner controlled. In this case, a significant portion of the closure extended onto my property. The concrete pad itself was now classified as a permanent structure installed on my land without permission. Under county ordinances, any permanent structure requires a permit and can only be installed on property you own. Julia had essentially built a concrete platform on my property. Second, the concrete had altered drainage patterns. Water that used to soak into the ground was now running off the concrete surface and pooling on my property in areas where it never had before. This was creating erosion issues and could potentially damage the foundation of my house if left unaddressed. Under county stormwater management codes, any construction that alters drainage patterns requires a drainage plan and permit. Third, and most damaging, the concrete extended into the root zone of several mature oak trees that straddled the property line. Dr. Bellamy measured them. 3 trees over 40 inches in diameter, 1 over 50 inches. These trees were easily 60 or 70 years old. In our county, any tree over 36 inches in diameter is automatically protected by ordinance. Any construction within the drip line of a protected tree requires a tree protection permit, a certified arborist's report, and specific mitigation measures. The concrete had been poured directly over the root zones of 3 protected trees without any of the required permits or protections. James compiled all of this into a new motion. The concrete pad constituted a new unauthorized permanent structure on my property. Julia had violated county stormwater management ordinances by altering drainage patterns without a permit, and she had violated tree protection ordinances by constructing over protected tree root zones without the required permits and arborist consultation. We went back to court 3 weeks later. Same judge, same attorneys. Julia looked exhausted. From what I'd heard through neighborhood gossip, the legal fees were adding up and she'd been forced to take out a home equity loan. Ms. Reeves argued that her client had done exactly what was required, removed the pool structure, and filled the cavity per code requirements for permanent closure. The county had inspected and approved the work. James agreed she'd followed pool closure codes, but by choosing permanent concrete closure instead of temporary dirt fill, she'd created a permanent structure that crossed property lines without permission. The county pool closure inspection only verified that the concrete met standards for filling a pool cavity. It didn't constitute approval for building a concrete platform on someone else's property. And by doing so without checking tree protection requirements or drainage impacts, she'd violated multiple additional ordinances. The judge read through Dr. Bellamy's report with an expression that grew progressively less sympathetic toward Julia. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Mrs. Morse, you were given a court order to remove construction from your neighbor's property and restore it to its previous condition. Instead, you've created a permanent concrete structure on his property, altered drainage in ways that could cause him property damage, and poured concrete over the root zones of protected trees without permits. Would you like to explain your reasoning?" Julia stood up. Good. Ms. Reeves tried to stop her, but Julia shook her off. "I followed the code requirements exactly," she said, her voice shaking with anger or stress or both. "I filled the excavation with concrete per county codes. I had it inspected. Everything was approved. If there are other permits I needed, no one told me that." You were required to restore the property to its previous condition, the judge said. The previous condition was not a concrete pad. Did you consider filling the excavation with dirt, as is standard practice? I chose the method that met code requirements for permanent closure, Julia said. There's nothing in the court order that specified what type of fill material to use. The court order required restoration to previous condition, the judge repeated. Concrete is not the previous condition. Furthermore, you had an obligation to verify that your method of compliance didn't violate other ordinances. You built a permanent structure on property you don't own, altered drainage without permits, and damaged protected trees. None of that is acceptable. He ordered Julia to remove all concrete from my property, properly fill the area with dirt and proper compaction while protecting the tree roots, obtain all necessary tree protection permits retroactively, and submit an arborist's plan for treating any damage to the protected trees and remedy any drainage issues created by the concrete work. He also ordered her to pay my legal fees and expert consultation costs to this point. The deadline was 60 days. This time, with the contempt threat implicit in the judge's tone, Julia started work within a week. Removing the concrete was apparently more expensive than pouring it had been. The concrete had cured for weeks by this point and was fully hardened. They had to bring in specialized equipment to break it up, and because it was in a backyard with limited access, they couldn't use the biggest, most efficient machinery. The work took 10 days of constant noise, dust, and debris. Chunks of concrete were hauled out through Julia's side yard, tearing up her lawn in the process. Then came the arborist. Dr. Mitchell was a certified arborist who specialized in tree trauma and recovery. He examined the 3 oak trees and determined that while the concrete hadn't killed them, it had compacted soil around their roots and prevented normal water and oxygen infiltration for several weeks. He prescribed a treatment plan involving soil decompaction, root aeration, deep watering, and nutrient supplementation. The work had to be done carefully to avoid causing additional root damage. Finally, the proper fill work began. County inspectors were present to verify that drainage was being addressed correctly. The fill had to be done in stages: 6 inches of dirt, then compaction, then another 6 inches, then more compaction. It took 3 weeks. I watched the whole process from my kitchen window. Every day, trucks and workers in Julia's yard. Every day, more money being spent to fix what could have been done simply and cheaply if she'd just verified the property line before starting construction in the first place. When it was finally finished, my property was restored. The dirt was properly compacted, graded to match the surrounding area, and new grass seed had been planted. The oak trees had been treated, and the arborist was cautiously optimistic they'd recover fully. Drainage was corrected. The financial damage to Julia was severe. According to the invoices she was required to submit to the court for the purpose of my cost reimbursement, the original pool construction had cost her $8,400. The first demolition was $14,200. The concrete fill she'd chosen cost $28,750 because she'd paid for expedited service to beat the deadline. Removing that concrete cost $41,300 because of the difficulty of the work. The proper dirt restoration was $11,800. The arborist treatment for the oak trees was $3,200. My legal fees and expert consultation costs that she was ordered to pay came to $24,650. Her own legal fees throughout the process were probably similar to mine, if not more. All told, she'd spent over $200,000 on a pool that never got finished, plus legal fees, plus paying my costs. And she still didn't have a pool. The neighborhood watched this entire saga unfold with a mixture of sympathy and vindication. Most people felt bad about the money she'd lost, but there was also a sense that she'd brought it on herself. If she'd been willing to have a simple conversation when I first approached her, we could have corrected the property line issue before construction went too far. Instead, she'd been confrontational at every step, refused to acknowledge any possibility she might be wrong, and made choices that seemed designed to be aggressive rather than practical. The voluntary HOA she'd created quietly dissolved. The handful of people who'd joined realized that Julia's judgment wasn't as sound as she'd claimed, and no one wanted to be part of an organization she led. The letters stopped coming. The citations for fence heights and garden gnomes disappeared. Julia stopped making eye contact with anyone in the neighborhood. She'd leave for work early and come home late, scurrying from her car to her house like she was trying to avoid being seen. The Hendersons told me she'd put her house up for sale about 6 months after everything was resolved. She sold it at a loss. The home equity loan she'd taken out meant she was underwater on the mortgage and she needed to sell quickly. A young couple with a baby bought the house. They're friendly, they wave when they see me, and they've never once mentioned property lines or HOA bylaws. I still have the oak trees. They recovered completely according to Dr. Mitchell's follow-up examination. Every time I sit in my backyard in their shade, I think about how different things could have been if Julia had just been willing to have a conversation like a reasonable neighbor. The surveyor's orange stakes are still in my garage. I kept them as a reminder that sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that could have been learned for free. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I work a behavioral healthcare agency. At the time this occurred, there were 14 therapists who reviewed paperwork from various psychiatric facilities. I'm the receptionist. I used to greet everyone that came and we'd have a wee chat, then get on with our work. Many had told me they enjoyed my cheerful attitude and hoped I never lost that happy spirit. At that time, director of my office singled me out on how she treated me. One month she was super cool and we got along great. The next month she'd be on me about every little thing I did. I didn't know what to do. One day she called me to her office and said I was being too social, talking too much with coworkers, not getting my work done, not true, etc. I needed to limit my conversations to just greeting people and leave it at that. I looked at her, saying I would do exactly as she said. No more socializing. Hand out assignments, say what it's for, and go back to my desk. She smiled, telling me that's what she wanted. The next morning I smiled and greeted people, then I put my head down and went back to work. When I would go to their offices and hand out assignments, they would start to chat. I'd stop them, apologize, telling them I had to get back to my desk. I'd get an odd look and a nod. This went on for several days. The following week, they started coming up to my desk, individually asking how I was doing. I seemed distant. If I had any problems, I could talk to them as their door was always open. I smiled, thanked them for their generosity and thoughtfulness, but I was fine and had to get back to work. As I mentioned, this went on every day for a week. The following week, the director called me into her office and asked what was wrong. I smiled and said, "Nothing is wrong. I'm doing my work and it's on time. Clinicians are getting their assignments and I'm keeping the chat to an absolute minimum, like you wanted." She looked at me and said the clinicians were concerned about me as I haven't been talking to them. They feel I might be going through some kind of depression and they told me their door is always open. She didn't say anything at first, then she told me, "Just keep the chats to a few minutes." I told her no problem. The next one is an entitled people story. Last year, I, a 40-year-old woman, left my position as a registrar for my local school district and moved into a more hands-on role as an instructional health aide at a special needs facility. Our facility has 2 main rooms, 2 bathrooms, a laundry room, and a small kitchen and dining area. The patients, whom I will call our friends, are all severely mentally or physically disabled, and many have both kinds of disabilities. Because of that, we need a full team in each room to keep everything running safely and smoothly. It is a busy job, but I love our friends and the amazing staff I work with. That is, until we got a new friend in April who came with a contracted aide. He was a 75-year-old man whom I will call Mr. JN. Mr. JN was mostly fine at first. He was the only male aide working among a group of women, so we were quick to establish some boundaries, particularly where the younger aides were concerned. At the same time, we tried to be welcoming and helpful. Since I was one of the older women on staff, he seemed to latch on to me for guidance. From a work perspective, he needed quite a lot of it. He could not lift, even though lifting was a requirement of the job. He got lost while transferring our friends between specialists and activities, and he was easily confused by new duties. During his first week, he also kept forgetting to bring lunch. I bought him sandwiches a few times or shared some of my own food with him. I am naturally friendly and helpful, and I wanted to make his transition into the facility easier. We are in Arizona, and he had moved from Chicago, so it was a major change for him. Eventually, Mr. JN started becoming more comfortable. That should have been a good thing. Then he started flirting with the staff. To be fair, I joked and flirted harmlessly with the women too. The difference was that I paid attention to people's boundaries, especially those of the younger aides. I also made sure Mr. JN understood when he was making someone uncomfortable. He tried to take things too far with me more than once. For example, he would pat his lap and suggest that I sit on it. I immediately told him that was inappropriate. Another time, he asked me for some of my lipstick, clearly implying that he wanted a kiss. I simply handed him the actual tube of lipstick and moved on to my next task while he sat there pouting. Then he brought in a portable oven. At first, we were excited. Every Friday, we held a cooking activity to teach our friends basic kitchen skills. Our area had a small kitchen, but no real oven, and the little toaster oven we did have was old. Mr. JN offered to bring in his oven. I probably should have noticed the warning sign when he asked me to help carry it inside. When I went to his car, I found a brand new, fully boxed air fryer oven. I had to carry it inside, unpack it, and set the entire thing up. Our lead aide insisted that Mr. JN did not need to go out and buy a new oven. But we figured that now we could bake cakes and make more food with our friends, so we accepted it. Anything for our friends, right? The next day, Mr. JN brought in 2 packages of stuffed mushrooms. He looked at the oven for maybe a minute before asking me to prepare the first package for his breakfast. I happened to have time, so I agreed and tried to turn it into a teaching activity for our friends. Then he demanded that I make the second package for his lunch. He was on his break. I was not. I told him that would be the last time I touched that oven for anything unrelated to cooking with our friends. The second warning sign was the way he quietly mumbled his acceptance. 2 weeks passed. He was a little grumpy, but still personable, and I pushed the stuffed mushroom incident to the back of my mind. Then he started talking about bringing in steaks or pork chops for lunch. From the beginning, I made it very clear that I would not prepare his food for him, including heating up meat. Apparently, I was still foolish enough to assume he meant a pre-cooked meal. Imagine my surprise when, on the Friday before Mother's Day, Mr. JN arrived carrying a completely raw, 1-inch thick, 10-ounce ribeye steak, along with butter and seasonings. Anytime I went into the kitchen while he had that steak out, I found myself following him around with a bottle of disinfectant. He had brought raw meat into a food preparation area used by medically fragile and severely disabled people. My job was already busy and stressful. The sexual harassment had not been pleasant, but I had shut it down and informed my team. Still, I had never felt quite as much stress as I did when a grown man brought a raw steak to work and apparently expected me to become his personal chef. Yes, he eventually cooked the steak himself. He did it during working hours while complaining about how unhelpful I was and how he had expected more workplace camaraderie from the ladies. Blah, blah, blah. Needless to say, he no longer works there. But I do not think I will get over the sheer audacity for quite some time. Thanks for reading my vent. Anyway, thank you for watching.